Hi there, this is Herb Mansavage for Atmosphere 101, Weather and Climate of Alaska. This week will be Unit 15, where we're discussing climate change. Um, for this presentation, I'm going to go ahead and start from the graphs and go over how each section of data that we looked at is uniquely different in that it does show climatic changes in areas that have, a pretty established average temperature. Um, the location that we're going to be looking at is Kotzebue, Alaska, and it's a unique location because of the coastal climate and then the Arctic climate as well from the north. The Brooks Range is fairly close to that, so you're getting um, wind movement through there that's different than you would see even in Nome. While Nome still has the mountains, they don't have the landmass that the Brooks Range creates. We'll be looking at the relative humidity and dew point temperatures, as well as the just basic average mean temperatures, as well as maximum and minimum temperatures. Um, for the most part, I'm going to do my best to describe these temperatures and dew points with correlation to the TV weather maps and how they represented changes through data and then visually. Um, like I said, starting from the graphs, we'll be able to determine how pressure systems and the dew points may have affected the amount of precipitation. Um, Starting with the surface air temperature for January 27th to February 3rd, you can see that there was a very normal climate for the first part of the days to the 29th. Then it started to break off into um, into swings in temperature and different climatic changes. Um, I'll be able to show you in relative humidity later when I compare it to the weather maps how you can see how a low pressure system may have caused this, or excuse me, a high pressure system may have caused this low temperature on the 1st of February, and then along with the low pressure system that may have rolled in afterwards and pushed it out and created those warmer temperatures. Um, but again, as you can see, the mean temperature is very close on the first day and then rises to the 31st, falls to as low as 22 below on the February 1st, and then rises to as much as almost 20 degrees, a 40-degree change in almost less than 24 hours. So um, we're going to look at the humidity and dew point temperatures. As you can see, the dew point temperatures and the humidity fell pretty close to what the average mean temperatures were showing, and with the spike in temperature on the 30th and then the drop and then back to normal. What's interesting here is that the relative humidity did not change during that drop in the dew point. This could be caused from the low pressure system remaining in that area and then being pushed out, or excuse me, the high pressure system and then being pushed out by the low pressure system, keeping that consistent. If we move on to the surface area temperatures of March, this was a different story. This is the other data that we've been using, and this was pretty consecutive lower for almost the entire time, with 24-hour intervals of very different temperature changes. Um, this this represents basically different or unusual for the region, but yet maintains a systematic approach to looking at the actual data. What I mean by that is that you see a pattern throughout the days. While it is colder, you are seeing close to the same types of temperature patterns from day to day throughout that period that it was different. And then following March 28th and then 29th, we have the rise in the temperature that did create some higher temperatures for that. Again, we'll be looking at the weather maps to correlate this with how the actual weather system showed. And then again, you see pretty close to the same idea of what was seen on the relative humidity and dew point temperature on the first section of data, you see the patterning. While it may be lower than it usually has, you still see a reflection with the temperature for that region. So starting off on Monday, we have a high pressure system throughout most of the state of Alaska, with low pressure systems building in the southeast and the southwest of Alaska. These are pressure systems with pressures of 972 to 1014, facing high pressure systems all the way up to 1040. With this, we have a low pressure system pushing towards the north, and following this low pressure system subsiding over the high pressure system, with the winds pushing to the north, the northeast, creating that high pressure system to dwell around the low pressure system. But what's interesting is you don't see the cloud cover that you would normally see with these low pressure systems. Although on Friday, you obviously see that the cloud cover follow in with the low pressure system, which is exiting to the southwest. But moving on to the March data, we see that we have the low pressure system from the beginning, and then following a high pressure system moving it out. What's interesting about this, though, is that from Monday to Friday, we saw a complete development of a high pressure system pushing out a low pressure system, but ending up with a subsided semi-low pressure system residing over the state, creating not much cloud cover, not much precipitation, or winds upon that. Let's pause this for a second. So as you can see, with the humidity and the relative humidity and the dew point temperature, it did follow pretty correlation with the temperature. But what was interesting is it did very much reflect what was on the TV weather map, especially on January 31st and February 1st. This is because we see that dew point dropping down and that relative humidity rising from the 29th and staying high up there due to that low pressure system maintaining with cloud cover covering most of the state, with thinner cloud cover though over Kotzebue. But as you can see with the surface air temperature, this would reflect that high pressure system moving in, pushing that low pressure system out, and then coming right back in and creating those higher temperatures. This is also is observable with the March. As you can see with the patterning that I described of the relative humidities throughout a 24-hour period. But what's hard to really understand is that from the 22nd to the 25th and 29th, those days in between on the weather map would have been much helpful to understand how this actually changed, because on the weather maps from the March 22nd, 5th, and 9th, you see the system's creating a lot of change, but yet we see a pretty consistent relative humidity patterning during that time, while the cloud cover is changing a lot, and there's not nearly as much of the dew point temperature reflection as you would see like on the 29th. So as I've tied in a lot of these questions for the analysis of this screencast, I'm going to go just over briefly what we're talking about, and basically change in the seasons that we're seeing from January to March is that with that January month and winter, it seems to reflect a very, should I say, confident amount of being average temperature throughout the month. Generally speaking, it's going to stay around the average. It seems that in the day-night variations, like I said, we're patterned very closely. It seems like even in springtime, while the patterns patterned well, they were much different, and this seems to be brought back into the planetary circulation, it seems the effects of the winter month between December, January, February, the climate that's created during that time extremely affects what's going to happen during January in March and the later spring months. Temperatures, if the temperatures are warmer, then a climatology does this represent clear skies or cloudy conditions with precipitation. I would generally guess that this would be a temperature with cloudy or temperatures that are warmer would be cloudy conditions with precipitation due to the low pressure systems caused often by the warmer temperatures and the wind creating these patterns that push the lower pressure systems out. I've already gone over the humidity and how to change the weather and that, but basically it's, we're seeing a higher relative humidity with the increase in temperature and the lower dew points and relative humidity with the lower temperature, especially in the below 0 degrees. The winds in this were a little hard for me to judge. That's why I did not bring them up as much. I don't have as much of an understanding, but it seemed that most of the winds throughout the course of this were coming from the east, many times in the northeast, pushing the system to the south, with many times the south systems pushing north, creating this kind of, center in Alaska where these systems will accumulate along with, as well as on the coast. And then I just explained why it's colder in March sometimes because of the changes in temperature during the winter months. But the meteorological conditions during this were somewhat unexpected due to the fact that the pressure systems represented and the systems that were shown with the TV weather maps reflected much more that of basic systems, I should say. I wish I had a better word for that, but anyway, yeah, basic systems. In the basic Kotzebue climate, I guess that would have to be said, would have to be probably the winter months, the January representation of data. This is just because the spring months, even though it's normal to see a great influx in change of weather, it's not going to be a very accurate representation of what that weather is like every year. You'd have to see a much more averaged out weather. And that concludes my screencast. Thank you.